President Trump continuing to struggle in the polls against his Democratic challenger, Joe Biden. And today, the President of the United States floated the idea of delaying November's election, something that he legally cannot do. He did so in a tweet. The president, yet again without evidence, attacked the integrity of mail-in voting, which is how he voted in the last election. He wrote in part, quote, "Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote." But as the Constitution tells us, only Congress has the authority to postpone a presidential election. And even despite similar crises like wars and economic turmoil, never in our history has our nation delayed an election. We should also know
my numbers every 5 minutes, and it also tells me which way.
Through the blood and sacrifice of American martyrs and heroes, including the blood of the American hero that was buried today with the tributes of 3 American presidents. In this country, we tell the government what to do, not the other way around. The point is, though, if Donald Trump could end the election, stop the election, if Donald Trump had the power to remain in office, we know for sure that he would exercise it. The reality is that he is being crushed politically. We received the worst economic news in the history of the country today. We are in a pandemic that will kill more Americans than the Japanese, Germans, and Italians during the Second World War were able to do before it's over. We all know that the school openings are going to be a disaster. And as we move into September, we're going to see a mortgage and eviction crisis begin in this country that will be 3 times what it was at the height of the Great Recession. We have dark and troubled days ahead, and we see an illiberal president testing the boundaries of American democracy, which he's done for 3.5 years. And what I'll say today, Brian, lastly, is what I said 4 years ago, is fascism didn't grow and thrive in the 1930s because it was strong. It grew and thrived because democracy was weak. And we have a sick and ailing democracy in this country where there is too many of our leaders have infidelity towards small L liberal democracy and small R Republican form of government. And it's a real problem and a real crisis.
Steve, I mean, on that problem and on that crisis specifically, every Democratic guardrail has been steamrolled by Donald Trump. So why do you think an election and a transfer of power will be different?
Well, I think that it will be different in the sense that when Donald Trump loses the election, I doubt very much we'll see the symbolism of the peaceful transition of power. There won't be coffee at the White House. We won't see Donald Trump on the dais. In the end, as someone pointed out last week, that in a democracy, it requires one side being willing to lose. It's the loser that cedes legitimacy to the winner through the electoral process that says, hey, we'll get you next time. We tried, we gave a message to the American people went with the other person. Trump is ceding the ground that this election, no matter the outcome, will be illegitimate. He'll never recognize the legitimacy of it should he lose the election. And 35% of the country or so won't recognize the legitimacy of the election, which means we're in very dangerous territory. But still at the end, Donald Trump can't stop anybody from voting. Only the American people can stop themselves from voting. He can do a lot of things, and they're going to do it to make it more difficult. But when you look at the strategy, the academic Sarah Kendzior has made this point over and over again, and it's spot on. Trump doesn't have a strategy to win the election. He increasingly simply has a strategy to try to get it closed through the introduction of enough chaos that he's able to steal it in the end. And we should all be vigilant about that, because if he can steal it, he will steal it. He has no fidelity to the American idea or ideals. It is a strange and foreign thought for him, the idea that the country was founded by leaders like George Washington, who voluntarily walked away from power when they otherwise could have been a king or an emperor.
streamline our language. There should be in our business no more talk of the president speaking in code or dog whistle. As I said last night, it's only dog whistle if your dog has gone deaf. Yesterday, he came out against low-income housing. Today, he said out loud on social media, we should perhaps delay our election. This is the world I leave to you. I'll be watching. Thank you for having me.
We'll be watching you at 11. Thank you, Brian. When we come back, with cases of coronavirus on the rise across this country, will it take a second lock?
We may no longer have to guess the number of jelly beans in a jar in order to cast a ballot. But even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run-up to an election that's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick. Now, I know this is a celebration of John's life. There are some who might say we shouldn't dwell on such things. But that's what I'm talking about. John Lewis devoted his time on this earth fighting the very attacks on democracy and what's best in America that we're seeing circulate right now. He knew that every single one of us has a God-given power, and that the fate of this democracy depends on how we use it. That democracy isn't automatic. It has to be nurtured. It has to be tended to. We have to work at it. It's hard. And so he knew that it depends on whether we summon a measure, just a measure of John's moral courage to question what's right and what's wrong and call things as they are. He said that as long as he had a breath in his body, he would do everything he could to preserve this democracy. And as long as we have breath in our bodies, we have to continue his cause. If we want our children to grow up in a democracy, not just with elections, but a true democracy, a representative democracy, in a big-hearted, tolerant, vibrant, inclusive America of perpetual self-creation, then we're going to have to be more like John. We don't have to do all the things he had to do because he did them for us. But we got to do something. As the Lord instructed Paul, do not be afraid. Go on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you. And no one will attack you to harm you, for I have many in this city who are my people. It's just, everybody's got to come out and vote. We got all those people in the city, but they can't do nothing. Like John, we've got to keep getting into that good trouble. He knew that nonviolent protest is patriotic, a way to raise public awareness and put a spotlight on injustice and make the powers that be uncomfortable. Like John, we don't have to choose between protests and politics. It's not an either-or situation. It's a both-and situation. We have to engage in protests where that's effective, but we also have to translate our passion and our causes into laws. institutional practices. That's why John ran for Congress 34 years ago. Like John, we've got to fight even harder for the most powerful tool that we have, which is the right to vote. The Voting Rights Act is one of the crowning achievements of our democracy. It's why John crossed that bridge. It's why he spilled his blood. And by the way, it was the result of Democratic and Republican efforts. President Bush, who spoke here earlier, and his father signed its renewal when they were in office. President Clinton didn't have to because it was the law when he arrived, so instead he made a law to make it easier for people to register to vote. But once the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act, some state legislators unleashed a flood of laws designed specifically to make voting hard. Especially, by the way, state legislators where there's a lot of minority turnout and population growth. That's not necessarily a mystery or an accident. It was an attack on what John fought for. It was an attack on our democratic freedoms. And we should treat it as such. If politicians want to honor John, and I'm so grateful for the legacy and work of all the congressional leaders who are here, but there's a better way than a statement calling him a hero. You want to honor John? Let's honor him by revitalizing the law that he was willing to die for. And by the way, naming it the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that is a fine tribute. But John wouldn't want us to stop there, just trying to get back to where we already were. Once we pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we should keep marching to make it even better by making sure every American is automatically registered to vote, including former inmates who've earned their second chance. By adding polling places and expanding early voting and making Election Day a national holiday, so if you are somebody who's working in a factory or you're a single mom who's got to go to her job and doesn't get time off, you can still cast your ballot. By guaranteeing that every American citizen has equal representation in our government, including the American citizens who live in Washington, D.C. and in Puerto Rico. They're Americans. By ending some of the partisan gerrymandering so that all voters have the power to choose their politicians, not the other way around. And if all this takes eliminating the filibuster, another Jim Crow relic, in order to secure the God-given rights of every American, then that's what we should do. Now, even if we do all this, even if every bogus voter suppression law is struck off the books today, we've got to be honest with ourselves that too many of us choose not to exercise the franchise. Too many of our citizens believe their vote won't make a difference, or they buy into the cynicism that, by the way, is the central strategy of voter suppression, to make you discouraged, to stop believing in your own power. So we're also going to have to remember what John said. If you don't do everything you can do to change things, then they will remain the same. You only pass this way once. You have to give it all you have. As long as young people are protesting in the streets, hoping real change takes hold, I'm hopeful, but we can't casually abandon them at the ballot box. Not when few elections have been as urgent on so many levels as this one. We can't treat voting as an errand to run if we have some time. We have to treat it as the most important action we can take on behalf of democracy. Like John, we have to give it all we have.
In this briefing, casting as much doubt as possible on the process. President Trump setting off another round of furious blowback with the tweet suggesting the election be postponed because of mail-in voting. The president saying, delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. It was a suggestion the president's challenger, Joe Biden, predicted more than 3 months ago in a teleconference saying, mark my words, I think he is going to try to kick back the election window somehow, come up with some rationale why it can't be held. The president has no power to delay the election. That's an issue for Congress. But even the president's Republican colleagues shot down the idea.
We'll cope with whatever the situation is and have the election on November 3rd as already scheduled.
The president's critics accused him of throwing a political hand grenade to distract from today's economic numbers, showing the U.S. economy shrank at an annualized 32.9% between April and June, the worst in history.
The president is very simply desperate. These new economic numbers, combined with the poll numbers, are making him petrified of the results of a fair, free election on time.
President Trump got some comfort on an expansion of mail-in voting from his closest allies in Congress, but not much more than that.
I understand the president's concern about mail-in voting, which is different than absentee voting. But never in the history of the federal elections have we ever not held an election, and we should go forward with our election.
Let's bring Gloria Borger into this conversation as well. Let's get back to the president's suggestions that maybe it's necessary to delay the November 3rd presidential election because he says if there's a lot of voting by mail, it will be fraudulent, it'll take a long time to determine, might take as many as years to determine, and he doesn't want to see that happening. It sounds, Gloria, like he doesn't know there are a whole bunch of states that have been doing voting by mail for a long time, including a state like Utah, for example, right. Oregon, and a whole bunch of other states have a lot of voting by mail. And at a time of coronavirus when people are afraid to go, let's say, to a voting booth, wait in line, voting by mail has been very effective and not controversial over many, many elections.
Well, and these are a lot of red states, too, Wolf, that have a lot of voting by mail. Look, this is a president who doesn't want to admit that it's gone very well in those states. And if you take a step back, what we heard today was kind of stunning. Because from the podium at the White House, you had a United States president deliberately undermining the potential results of a presidential election. Think about that. In advance of the votes being cast or counted, the president is saying it's going to be rigged. It's going to wind up in court. And I agree with what John Harwood was saying. This is a president who seems to feel demoralized when you heard him today. He read the statistics with all the enthusiasm of somebody reading the phone book today. And he didn't disavow entirely the case he made about wanting to delay the election. He said, sure, I don't want to delay the election, but just understand that it's going to be rigged. So he's setting the country up right now for more divisiveness, not to accept any kind of results in this election. And one more thing, Wolf. He said, you know, I want to know what the result is going to be on election night. I'm not going to wait around sounding like, well, he wanted to have his party or he wanted to go home, one way or the other, even though Republicans and official Republicans in the campaign have said, look, we understand that we're going to have to wait in some states, but not the president. He wants to know, just like the good old days, he wants to know that night and find out what it is. Otherwise, as he hinted, you know what, it's a mess, it's going to wind up in court, it's going to be litigated, it's going to take years. I mean, it's kind of...
House reads books about submarines.
He's spinning the bully Rubik's Cube right now, trying to find the right colors.
But he also did not get asked about what his predecessor said today. Barack Obama at the funeral for John Lewis as he was eulogizing him, where he had some pretty stinging attacks on President Trump and what he's been trying to say about mail-in ballots and about voting rights. He was really lashing into the president, and Trump did not get asked about that, which I thought was pretty notable because, you know, he was the only living president not to attend that funeral today. Bush spoke, President Obama spoke, and President Clinton spoke. Jimmy Carter was not there because he's not traveling for health reasons, but it was really striking to see President Trump not be at that funeral speaking next to those other presidents, and instead is here back at the White House and did not comment on John Lewis's funeral at all today.
Yeah, and John Harwood, it was the words of the former president, Barack Obama, at that funeral. He didn't mention the president by name, but it was clear who he was addressing those words to. At one point saying, even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run to an election. It's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick. They will get sick in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic if they have to go to polling stations and wait in line with a lot of people around there on Election Day, November 3rd. Potentially, it's very, very dangerous.
Well, there's no question about it, and the President Obama's words were incredibly stinging today. He invoked the specter of Bull Connor and George Wallace, who were racist figures who were involved on the wrong side of the civil rights movement, trying to stop integration, trying to stop voting rights, the violence against protesters then, and that has incredible weight at this moment because you have a president who's running a campaign of naked racism. He yesterday revoked a fair housing regulation and linked it, fair housing, that is racial integration, to crime and low-income people. He's tweeted out somebody saying white power. This is stuff that would be jolting even in John Lewis's era, but now it is incredibly out of step with where the American people are. And I think that's why it contributes to the president's sense of being beleaguered, because he's trying all these things. They're not working. They're not resonating with the American people.
All I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. Lewis lived that history physically. It was written onto his body. In later years, he could point to scar lines on his head and say, this was from Selma. This was from Montgomery. Brett?
Steve Harrigan, live in Atlanta. Steve, thanks.
Just be an entry point to an argument, largely emotional, but nevertheless immensely disruptive, to setting up a November where he is crying foul and crooked election and fake news and fake president about Joe Biden if Biden wins. The other thing to watch is, yes, those senators were saying the right thing today. What if Trump begins to make the case to them? At least two of them are running in races that are far closer than they would want them to be. What if he begins to make the case to the Senate Republican caucus that if the Senate were to flip on November 3rd and subsequent days, what if it becomes in their interest to join him in questioning the legitimacy of an election that puts them out of work?
Well, you're raising so many things, John. I want to
immense question.
I want to slow you down for follow-up because you've got more than one interesting thing there. On the departure, again, we do the legal facts. And so when you talk about whether this is a bid for him to try to have leverage over delay, we go, of course, and we think of the 20th Amendment. And I'll put it up so everyone can remember what we're dealing with. Some of these things have already been thought through. The terms of the Vice President and President end at noon on the 20th day of January, John, an amendment that further clarifies and cannot be changed by the President or Congress that you're out no matter what.
Okay, I may end up seeming alarmist here, but this seems to be a moment for at least a measure of alarmism.
You are known, John. I'm going to give you the mic back, but we welcome you. If you are feeling the facts lead you to alarmism, you are known by some as a genteel and courtly presence over the decades on air. So if today is the day, the night you want to be alarmist, go for it. I'll go you, and then Christina, and then we have a Biden campaign person who's going to be responding to some of this. So you and then Christina.
Sure. I think that, yes, the 20th Amendment passes that, institutes that. But we've never had anyone challenge it. Remember, the Constitution, in fact, depends on people of sufficient goodwill that the norms work. So, really interesting question. Let's say the president is suing 35 states that he loses in court. Through November and December into January. Again, I hope none of this happens, but I think we have to think about it because, again, Donald Trump is president, so we have to think about everything. He's suing the states. He says, no, I don't believe Joe Biden is president. How does he get removed from the premises? Yes, people can say that that Biden and whomever are now in office, but does the military chain of command come into being? Does the uniformed Secret Service come into being? The Electoral College, to my knowledge, has no enforcement mechanism except people who accept that this country has gone from strength to strength for people who defer to the law.
Let me bring Christina in as promised. Now I feel like, are we on the beat or are we on an episode of 24 where the Secret Service march the defiant president off? This is what John Meacham's bringing tonight, also known as Hot Fire. Christina, you get the final word in this topic.
Right. So I understand John's alarm, and I have some of those concerns as well. And we realize so much that's in the Constitution is based purely on norms, and there isn't really any implementation guide there. And I definitely believe that we can't necessarily put our faith in our Republican Senate colleagues to do the right thing, because we have seen them abdicate to the president so quickly. But I do think that, you know, this is what Donald Trump was trying to set up in 2016 to call into question as to whether or not he would accept the election results when he was pretty sure that Hillary Clinton would win. So yes, we do need a 1972 style blowout, this time for the Democrats, for Joe Biden to definitively win. But also we need a lot of Republicans to stand up and respect the Constitution over a man who does not. And we haven't seen that in the past 3.5 years.
All facts.
John Lewis was a walking rebuke to people who thought, well, we ain't there yet. We've been working a long time. Isn't it time to bag it? He kept moving.
Listen, John and I had our disagreements, of course. But in the America John Lewis fought for, and the America I believe in, differences of opinion are inevitable elements and evidence of democracy in action.
His relationship with President Barack Obama was an important one. Like many black Americans, Lewis was in tears the night history was made and Obama was elected. In his eulogy, Obama pointed to this important moment, the bloody Sunday on this bridge in Alabama, when Lewis nearly lost his life at the hands of police while marching for voting rights. It was months later when the laws changed and many in his own family were able to vote for the first time.
This idea that any of us, ordinary people, a young kid from Troy, can stand up to the powers and principalities and say, no, this isn't right, this isn't true, this isn't just. We can do better. America was built by people like that. America was built by John Lewis's.
The former president argued that forces are still trying to suppress the vote today, right now, in November's election.
Even as we sit here, there are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run-up to an election that's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick.
Outside, people watched and waved in the heat. Lewis was beloved and was buried tonight in an Atlanta cemetery founded by freed slaves who at the time had nowhere else to bury their dead with dignity. The final resting place for a man of so much purpose.
Lead me home.
And Steve Osunsami with us here in Atlanta tonight. And Steve, I know you have interviewed John Lewis along the way, and there were so many gathered outside the church here, as you know. One woman telling me, in a word, that he was humble, direct, and that he fought right until the very end.
Well, David, we are, of course, in his congressional district, and he was beloved, and not just by black residents, but by white residents, women, gays. In fact, his family made sure that as his body was being moved to the streets of Atlanta, that they passed through the heart of gay Atlanta. And it's all because he spent his entire life fighting for others. David?
Steve Osunsami leading us off tonight. Steve, thank you. And just hours before the service began, President Trump, who did not attend, did send out a tweet suggesting that Election Day be delayed. It set off a firestorm, even Republican leaders jumping in and quickly to try to put this to rest. Here's Terry Moran tonight on that.
No president has ever said anything like it, but President Trump, behind in the polls with a cratering economy and a pandemic out of control, tweeting today, with universal mail-in voting, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. It will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote. Later, the president tried to explain what he meant.
Do I want to see a date change? No, but I don't want to see a crooked election. This election will be the most rigged election in history if that happens.
That's a flip-flop. In April, Trump said this.
I never even thought of changing the date of the election. Why would I do that? November 3rd. It's a good number. No, I look forward to that election.
Trump's statement today about delaying an American election was shot down immediately by Democrats and Republicans. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in an interview in Kentucky.
Never in the history of the country, through wars, depressions, and the Civil War, have we ever not had a federally scheduled election on time.
But Joe Biden has been warning for weeks Trump might try to use the pandemic to delay or delegitimize the election.
It's my greatest concern, my single greatest concern. This president's going to try to steal this election. This is the guy who said that all mail-in ballots are fraudulent, voting by mail, while he sits behind the desk in the Oval Office and writes his mail-in ballot to vote in the primary.
And Terry Moran with us tonight. And Terry, I know amid all this talk about mail-in ballots and election security, that ABC News did reach out to election officials in all 50 states, Democrats and Republicans, about whether they're concerned about mail-in voting.
That's right, David. We've heard from 27 of those top election officials across the country, and not one of them, Republican or Democrat, has expressed any concern that mail-in voting would cause any significant fraud in their states. It's also worth noting, David,
we turn now to that tweet from President Trump today, raising the possibility of putting off the November elections, even though only Congress has that power. Well, tonight, leaders of the president's own party are rejecting the idea. Here's CBS's Ben Tracy.
President Trump's stunning suggestion that the election be delayed comes as he's trailing badly in the polls, and at the same time the nation's GDP reached a historic low. In a remarkable tweet, he made the unfounded claim that mail-in voting will make the election the most inaccurate and fraudulent in history, and suggested a delay until people can properly, securely, and safely vote.
I don't want to delay. I want to have the election. But I also don't want to have to wait for 3 months and then find out that the ballots are all missing and the election doesn't mean anything.
The president has no power to delay an election. The Constitution says only Congress can change the date, and mail-in voter fraud, repeatedly cited by Mr. Trump, is extremely rare. Today, the top Republicans in Congress rebuked the idea.
We'll cope with whatever the situation is and have the election on November 3rd as already scheduled.
Never in the history of the federal elections have we ever not held an election, and we should go forward with our election.
In April, former Vice President Joe Biden predicted the president would try to move the election. The president's tweet came as John Lewis, a man who spent his life fighting for voting rights, was laid to rest. Democratic Representative James Clyburn, a longtime friend, called the president's suggestion of a delayed election the most despicable affront to Lewis's memory and legacy. Despite questioning the safety of holding an election during coronavirus, the president continues to push for schools to reopen, saying there isn't much risk to children.
The younger, the better. Amazing, the immune system. For children, the lower they are in age, the lower the risk.
The president was asked during that briefing tonight if, given the outbreaks of coronavirus in Major League Baseball, can he really assure people that schools will be safe? The president responded by saying, "Can you assure anybody of anything?" Nora.
Ben Tracy from the White House tonight. Thank you, Ben.
Kinds of people, left and right, responded to that. Meantime, there was other news today on the economy front. The real GDP decreasing at an annual rate of 32.9% in the second quarter. Obviously, the shutdown and COVID affecting all of this, but it's massive. It's historic compared to a decrease of 5% in Q1. But that's not what everybody's talking about. Everybody's talking about the president's tweet about possibly delaying the election. Let's bring in our panel. Matthew Continetti, founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon, Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief at USA Today, and Bill McGurran, columnist for the Wall Street Journal. Bill, what do you think about this whole dust-up and the president's explanation at the news conference?
Well, look, I think he's right about in terms of the delays that we've had in primary results, election results. This is not a good thing. It's amazing that the more advanced we are in technology, the less capable we seem to be of getting results tonight. As you pointed out, he doesn't have the legal authority to postpone the elections. You know, part of me wonders if this isn't like his thing on COVID about federalism, to say one thing and get all the Democrats to agree we don't want any delay in elections. I mean, sometimes it just seems to me he takes a big meaty bone and he throws it off in an area and everyone goes running after it. You know, as you say, it's not going to happen because of the law, and but I think there are some legitimate complaints about possible fraud, about what happens if all across the country we get competing versions of results. That's not a good thing for democracy.
You know, I'll just play some of the reaction, and it was all over the board, Susan. Here's a few lawmakers.
There's no way legally the President of the United States can cancel, delay, postpone the election. It's unconstitutional.
I realize you talked to Vladimir Putin the other day, but I don't even think Putin would try to convince him to do that.
Never in the history of the country, through wars, depressions, and the Civil War, have we ever not had a federally scheduled election on time, and we'll find a way to do that again this November 3rd.
Susan, it was pretty amazing how many people were asked about it, how many people weighed in. I mean, it really did overtake the news cycle.
You know, one thing that's not going to happen this year, we're not going to delay the election. But I think you were right on point in your introduction. The provocative tweet about this came 16 minutes after the devastating announcement of the contraction in the economy in the second quarter. And if you're looking for news developments today that will affect what happens on Election Day, the state of the economy is going to be more important than the president's tweet about possibly delaying the election.
Yeah. Matthew?
I think all the panelists make good points. Was one thing that President Trump may have been trying to do also was justify a loss if he loses in November, to say that this was a rigged election and that he never had a shot because of the fake ballots. And so it gives him a good story. But, you know, the thing is, the more he discounts mail-in ballots, the more he delegitimizes the election process, I think the more it hurts his chances. It would be better if I think for his election chances if he took more of an affirmative effort to bolster the election process, more polling places, make sure there are no delays, and reassert the importance of American institutions.
Yeah, you know, and we've put out this word, and we've done a few stories about it, that no matter where we are on mail-in ballots by the time November election comes around, it's very likely we're not going to have a decision on election night, or even a few days. And that's something that people have to get their head around, including this president, but we'll see where it goes. Meantime, the former president, Barack Obama, as well as George W. Bush and former President Clinton, eulogizing the late Congressman John Lewis. Take a listen to former President Obama at one point in that eulogy.
There are those in power who are doing their darndest to discourage people from voting by closing polling locations and targeting minorities and students with restrictive ID laws and attacking our voting rights with surgical precision, even undermining the Postal Service in the run-up to an election that's going to be dependent on mail-in ballots so people don't get sick.
Now, Bill, you know, it obviously was stirring, and it had a lot of progressive policies in this speech, and it was a tribute to John Lewis. But flipped around, had this happened on the Republican side of this kind of eulogy, I wonder what the reaction would have been.
No, we don't have to wonder. We know it would be a lot of, you know, condemnation. I have to say, you know, John Lewis did incredibly brave things early in his career, was a real champion. And as he's being laid to rest, there's been a lot of bipartisan support for him from conservatives and Republicans and respectful. And I have to say, I compare that to the reaction, at least that I saw on Twitter, to Herman Cain's death, which seems, some of it is so repellent, suggesting he deserved it. I mean, two extraordinary men who lived quite extraordinary lives, and it's just dispiriting to see that kind of difference.
Yeah, and you know, the celebration of John Lewis's life over the past few days has been inspirational to look at.
When he decided to run for office, Lillian was his chief advisor, in on every major decision I made.
She got in there and became his best defender, his best ally, his best supporter, and would jump on people if they had critical things to say about John.
Lillian died in 2012 on New Year's Eve, 45 years to the day that she met her husband.
I think he's ready to go see Lillian again.
John and Lillian's first home was a small home here in Atlanta, and they never moved away. Tonight, they are reunited for eternity. We'll be right back. This portion of the CBS.
America was built by John Lewis's. Someday when we do finish that long journey towards freedom, when we do form a more perfect human, whether it's years from now or decades or even if it takes another 2 centuries, John Lewis will be a founding father of that fuller, fairer, better America. What a gift John Lewis was. We are also lucky to have had him walk with us for a while and show us the way.
John Lewis was truly a great, great American who made our country better. I think I speak for all of our viewers here in the U.S. and around the world. Our deepest, deepest condolences to his family and his friends. May he rest in peace, and may his memory be a blessing.
Tonight, remembering the man who changed America. Congressman John Lewis honored as a nonviolent warrior who fought for true peace. 3 former presidents there paying tribute to the man who crossed bridges and broke down barriers. Barack Obama calling him the founding father of a better America, a man who liberated all of us on the battlefield of justice. Plus, Lewis's own powerful message published today. Also tonight, backlash after President Trump floated potentially delaying the election. Many Republicans joining Democrats and pushing back on that. John Lewis, born in tiny segregated Troy, Alabama, the son of sharecroppers, celebrated today by presidents, including the first black president, who says he was elected standing on Lewis's shoulders.
On Inauguration Day in 2008, 2009, he was one of the first people I greeted and hugged on that stand, and I told him, this is your day too.
Former President Obama, one of many today, calling to strengthen the Voting Rights Act that Lewis championed.
You want to honor John? Let's honor him by revitalizing the law that he was willing to die for.
And while not naming him, launching a forceful attack against President Trump.
George Wallace may be gone, but we can witness our federal government sending agents to use tear gas and batons against peaceful demonstrators.
John Lewis's own words also echoing in that church. In the extraordinary essay he submitted to the New York Times just before his death, published this morning, his message to those marching now. While my time has come to an end, he wrote, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe.
It is so fitting on the day of his service, he leaves us our marching orders.
The tributes today, intensely personal.
When he could have been angry and determined to cancel his adversaries, he tried to get converts instead. He thought the open hand was better than the clenched fists. I just loved him. I always will. And I'm so grateful that he stayed true to form. He's gone up yonder and left us with marching orders. I suggest, since he's close enough to God to keep his eye on the sparrow and us, we salute, suit up, and march on.
Emotional.
The night that John passed. When this flag flew there, it said goodbye. It waved goodbye to John, our friend, our mentor, our colleague.
And candid.
Listen, John and I had our disagreements, of course. But in the America John Lewis fought for, and the America I believe in, differences of opinion are inevitable elements and evidence of democracy in action. We live in a better and nobler country today because of John Lewis.
I'm the master of my fate.
Including a tribute from a 12-year-old boy Lewis met at the anniversary of the Selma March.
John Lewis was my hero, my friend. Let's honor him by getting in good trouble.
He was in good trouble. A celebration of that unbreakable spirit.
America was built by John Lewis's. And someday when we do finish that long journey towards freedom, when we do form a more perfect union, whether it's years from now or decades or even if it takes another 2 centuries, John Lewis will be a founding father of that fuller, fairer, better America.
John Lewis is being laid to rest alongside his wife of 44 years, Lillian. A strong backlash tonight after President Trump suggested that this fall's election could be delayed over his concerns about mail-in voting. NBC's Peter Alexander has more on that from the White House.
Facing a surging pandemic and struggling in the polls, President Trump today for the first time is suggesting the November election, just 96 days away, be postponed. Tweeting, with universal mail-in voting, 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. Warning it will be a great embarrassment to the USA. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote?
I don't want to delay. I want to have the election. But I also don't want to have to wait for 3 months and then find out that the ballots are all missing and the election doesn't mean anything.
But the president has no power to delay a general election. The Constitution says it's up to Congress to set the date. And with Democrats controlling the House, that will not happen. There's also no evidence of widespread voter fraud due to mail-in balloting. President Trump's suggestion immediately dismissed even by top Republicans.
We'll cope with whatever the situation is and have the election on November 3rd as already scheduled.
Nope.
He can't handle situations that he feels he's being upstaged. But if you look at his tweet about the housing situation, it is consistent because in the 70s, his father and he were sued by the federal government for housing discrimination. They had to settle a discrimination lawsuit. He's played that race card of housing all of his career. And he's only going back to what he's always done. What he doesn't realize is that America no longer exists. Are there people in the suburbs that may have racist tendencies? Sure, but they are everywhere. But, Joy, we're in the era of gentrification. People from the suburbs are moving into the city. Who is he talking to?
Exactly.
The problem that we have in National Action Network, we get people saying we're being pushed out to the suburbs from the inner city.
That's right.
So he's talking to people that doesn't exist. He's still watching 1950s TV. He probably has a black and white television in his office.
Yeah, he's not up to date.